Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Catch-Up Wednesday, where I will be giving you a short snippet into the sermon that was preached last week Sunday. Don't worry if you missed the sermon, you can always catch it on our Facebook or YouTube channel at PVN Belfast. Alright, so our sermon last week was taken by our guest speaker, Pastor Paul Dunn, who titled his sermon, Going the Distance, Don't Stop at 6. And at the start of the sermon, he had reached out to those who were watching and asked us basically if there was anyone who had felt like quitting or anyone who had felt like giving up, and it asked us to go the distance. And the text that we read was from Hebrews 10 verse 36, which simply says that if we persevere and we do the will of God, then we can receive the promise that he has for us. And we were asked to keep going, that even if we felt like things were not working, things were fading out, we had to keep persevering to receive the promise that God has for us. And as the sermon was going on, he gave us 3 illustrations from Joshua chapter 6. And these 3 illustrations are 3 reasons why we believe that people don't go the distance. Reason 1 as to why people don't go the distance is because of what they can't see, because sometimes their perspective is blocked. The speaker made us realize that sometimes when we see other people's victories, we assume that the process was easy or we oversimplify the process, which is not usually the case. With Joshua chapter 6, we see that it took Joshua 45 years to get to Jericho, which was the first city that the children of Israel had to conquer before they could fulfill the promise of God. And most times our first battle or our first challenge is usually the hardest one, and it's usually the hardest time that we have when it's time to get started. But perseverance is very key for us to get through these. The thing about Jericho was not necessarily a big city, but it had high walls. And sometimes when we focus on the walls, or when God has promised something for us and we focus on the walls, we never really fulfill the promise that God has for us. The reality is we have God with us and God in us, so there's no problem that's too big. But because sometimes our perspective is blocked, we always focus on the walls rather than the fact that God is there to see us through it. So it's very important that our perspective is not blocked and that we keep our eyes and we keep our focus on God, and we will get through any wall or any challenge that is placed in front of us. No problem is too big for God, as was illustrated in reason 1. Why people don't go the distance is usually because, according to our speaker, people are always focused on when is it going to happen. And in the case of Joshua 6, 3-4, in the case with the children of Israel, after Joshua had received an instruction from God that they were to march around Jericho for 6 days, and on the 7th day march around 7 times, shouting and screaming. We were told that Joshua did not give this instructions to the children of Israel, rather he kept the instructions from God to himself. And of course, sometimes when we're going through our challenges in life or we're doing things, we tend to stop halfway just before we're about to get to our point. Joshua had asked the children of Israel to march in silence, not telling them why or not telling them what God had told him or the instructions that God had given to him. So they spent day 1, day 2, all the way up onto day 6, marching not knowing when or what the instruction was going to be for them to do. And sometimes because we don't know when it's going to happen, we find it very difficult going the distance. I'm here to encourage everyone and to let them know, don't stop halfway, don't stop at 6, go past that time, persevere and see how long you can go till you get to God. Reason 3 why most people don't go the distance sometimes is because they always question who is in control, who do we trust? And as was said to us by our speaker with his illustration, it was possible that as the days went by and the children of Israel were marching, they probably began to question who was in charge or whether or not what Joshua was asking them to do was right. Because I'm sure after the first couple of days, the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, where nothing was happening, they probably began to doubt. They probably began to think, are they doing the right thing? Is there any point to what they're doing? So it's possible that they started to lose trust in the word, seeing as Joshua didn't tell them the instruction that God had given to him. And I'm sure sometimes, as our guest speaker said, it's possible that one of the reasons why after the first day, the second day, the third day, that the walls didn't begin to crack or crumble a little bit is because God wanted to see how much trust they have in him. And sometimes when it seems like things aren't working, we need to remember that God is working. Sometimes God sends us some challenges, or sometimes he makes things, sends us some walls or makes things a bit longer or a bit more difficult to know if we truly trust in him and who do we trust in him. Sometimes I feel like, according to the speaker, he said, we focus so much on what we think God has planned for us, but sometimes he sends us walking around walls to test and to see what is really going on in us and how much trust we have in him. And we focus so much solely on the promise that we try to get to rather than what is internal and who we actually trust. So the reason 3 why a lot of people do not go the distance is because who do they think is in control? Where do they place their trust? In conclusion, we were told that if we walk and live every day like it's our last, giving our absolute best, that one day that God is right there with us and one day we will receive the promise that He has for us. God is there with us every minute, and like even when it feels like He's not working, trust me, God is working. If things aren't working, if things aren't moving, God is working. We just need to persevere. We need to go the distance. Don't stop at 6. Keep pushing on, and trust me, you will receive the promise that God has for us. Thank you very much for listening to this short snippet. Like I said earlier on, you can catch the full sermon on our Facebook or YouTube channel. Thank you, and we hope to see you next Sunday.